So Otway realizes that he's probably not going to get the coup de main from the glider force. So he gives the order. He can't wait any longer. He gives the order, and then Major Parry blows a whistle, and the guys blow the Bangalore torpedoes. And this blows up the two of the approaches that Major Smith had identified and the taping party had identified. This blows up a gap in the wire, and then Otway says, get in, and the attack begins. He says that there was booby traps in the wires, mines were going off, they charge in, and some of them laid down on the wire to act as a mattress, and then these two groups, it's difficult to say how many were. It could be anything of 30 to 50, maybe more. They run in and start fanning out. The casements, he describes that they had steel doors on the front. There was steel doors on the back, of the casements. And so the only way to get into these casements was through the front. He recalls he went in as well, followed people in, and he could see. He says he recalls that he could see Sergeant Knight, who he believed had actually come in through the main gate. He reports that there's a machine gun fire coming from a tower that he had to keep running, moving around and avoiding. And the assault proceeds. Hand-to-hand fighting happens. Lieutenant Mike Dowling comes back to him and reports that the battery's been taken. And Otway replies, has the guns been destroyed? And Dowling replies, I think so, which is then gets a prompt reprimand and told to go back and make sure that the guns are taken out. He reports during this as well, there's the glider crash to the southeast has actually distracted the Germans, and there's a battle going on around that. And the occupants of that glider, the survivors, were engaged with a platoon of Germans. So, in terms of what actually happened in the actual assault, Number 12 platoon was commanded by Lieutenant Alan Jefferson, and he headed for number 1 gun, which is on described as being on the extreme right. Now, I'm not quite familiar with which one of these is the extreme right, but let me know if you know. And he gets he's injured by attacking this, but he gets shot in the leg. But he watches his platoon storm into the emplacement. Other notable casualties: Major Parry is shot in the leg as well as he enters the battery. And remember, he was commanding the second breach, and George Adsett at this point is killed. Parry applies a tourniquet to his legs, and he limps to the number 1 gun that Alan Jefferson's attacked, and he gets there just as the Germans are being escorted out with their hands up. When Major Parry arrives at the emplacements, this is when he discovers that the guns are not the 150mm ones that they expected, but were he describes them as old-fashioned field pieces. So it turns out that the guns aren't the same caliber, the caliber they thought they were. And number 3 and number 4 gun emplacements are dealt with in a similar fashion. Major Parry orders that the breech blocks be destroyed using plastic explosive, and he says that is carried out. Now, there's a controversy around this. We'll get to that in a minute. So when Lieutenant Mike Dowling has reported to Otway that they have been destroyed, Otway has to he has to go back in and check. Because a mortar lands close to Dowling, and him and his Batman are killed. So he leads the remainder of his force back into the battery to mop up what he calls the bits of resistance. He reports that the machine guns were opening up on them. So there was a chaos going on. And that's when but he does say that when the Germans realized that they were paratroopers, they would put their hands up. He says that, I think there was only 23 prisoners taken. Most of the garrison were either killed or wounded. And when he gets to the emplacements, he finds that what's happened is that the troops have put grenades down the barrels, but because this is really hard metal, the effect of these grenades on the guns is minimal. He says he also takes out the breech blocks and throws them away, so they couldn't fire without getting new breech blocks. Effectively, what he's saying is that he didn't have the equipment to destroy these guns properly. And what he's done here is technically he's not destroyed them, but he's delayed he's delayed them coming back into action. After this, he recalls that the action has died down, and he wanders around the area, looking at some of the wounded, and talking to the medic who was looking after Captain Hudson, who'd been injured. So with time moving on, Otway decides that the best thing to do is to gather up his prisoners, and he orders them to basically walk in front of him through the minefield. He calls it them showing us the paths through the minefield, but well, we can guess what he's doing. At this point, he describes that the Germans begin to shell and mortar the position from Franceville, the flak positions at Franceville, which is this area here. And he said that the shelling had completely disregarded the fact that there were Germans here, so they just knew the paratroopers are here. They wanted to stop them from destroying the guns, so they started pounding the position. So again, it's difficult to know how many men were involved. Reports, as I say, vary from 50 to 150. He does mention that afterwards that 150 men who actually attacked, when they came out there were 65 to 70 that were still on their feet, and the rest were wounded or killed. So they capture a German medic in their prisoners, and to Otway reports that to the German medic's credit, he goes back into the battery to get his medical supplies, and and begins to treat the wounded. He says that the padre, who was hanging back, he went off, he says, to what he calls a local village with some French men, and he comes back with some trucks and German staff cars in which they put the wounded in. He draws a red cross on the front of in order to get to the 6th Airborne Division, which was forming its headquarters at Ranville, which is this village down here to the south. So he hoped that the Red Cross would give them passage. So the guns turned out not to be the ones that they thought. They turned out to be World War One era 100mm field howitzers, and these were Czech built, and they had an effective range basically of about just over 5 miles. So the Germans actually you were using them more to sort of cover the entrance and the port of Ouistreham, and cover the beach along here, but didn't really have the effective range to affect the far end, the middle to far end of Salt. But that doesn't take away the bravery that these guys showed in storming this battery, because they weren't to know. What happens then? Well, he when at this point he says he's satisfied that the guns are out of action, and he orders his signal officer to fire a pistol which emitted a yellow smoke, and he also says that the signal officer releases a pigeon that is sent to London. Now, this is to signal to the ship. The yellow smoke is the signal to the ships out in the channel, not to fire. It turns out, I believe, that I'm just trying at the moment to find out what the name of the ship was. Bear with me. It turns out this ship, it's around about 5 I believe. Let me find it. Yeah, so he fires the smoke. It's written here at 4:45. Just trying to find this. Yeah, so and the signal is out to a cruiser called HMS Arethusa. Arethusa was going to attack or open fire on the battery at 5 a.m. if they hadn't seen this signal. I believe that the cruiser, even though the smoke is sent up, the cruiser doesn't see the smoke. But because the battery isn't firing, the commander of the HMS Arethusa decides not to bombard the place. I mean, he may even could see that the Germans were bombarding or mortaring them from the beach. But he decides, because he hasn't seen the signal and there's nothing coming, but more importantly, there's no actual firing from the battery, he doesn't fire on it. So we're getting towards daybreak, and Otway orders his remaining force to withdraw to the rendezvous point, and then his orders were then from there to occupy high ground close to the village Plein. So let me just try and find this place. Le Plein. Let's see if I can find. Okay, so can't quite. Okay, there we go. I think. So Le Plein is to the south, in a village called I think it's called Le Ampheville, which is just to the northwest of Merville. Now, so the Merville is on the ridge, So this is drop zone. This is the drop zone here for the 7th Battalion. This is the Merville Ridge here, and Amfreville is it's this village, I believe, here. So let's have a look at the ground. He describes it as his orders were to occupy the high ground close to the village of Plein and capture a small naval radar station en route. And because he's only got 80 fit men, he ignores the capture of the radar station. So this looks like it's probably the area that he's told to move to. You've got the Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge here. This is Ramville. This is where the 7th Battalion is forming up their headquarters. So it makes sense that they will probably, the idea is to, once these coup de main operations have occurred, they bring the paratroopers back from these outlying areas, and they bring them back to the higher ground that surrounds the bridgehead. So the bridgehead is kind of using this. You can just sort of make out this ridge sort of starts in this area here. You got the river here, but you can see this slight rise here. This high ground, as you can see, you've got great views down to Sword Beach, Ouistreham. You've got the approach to Caen across the river. So this is the ground that was needed to be held. So this is they call it Le Plein, and it's Amfreville. And we're talking now time-wise. Anything after 5 o'clock in the morning. So that makes sense. They're pulling back their troops. They're using the drop zones. The drop zones over here, this is Varaville, were used to attack the battery, and also to use as a jumping off point to attack the bridges. And destroy the bridges on the River Dives, which is over here. This, you can see why there's grumblings by the Canadian Parachute Battalion that they felt that they were stuck out on a limb over in this direction. But this river below us here has a number of bridges that are to be taken out, as far as well, the hope I think was down to Esquiville. So we're talking the bridges down to Troan, which is in this area here. They want to capture this ridge that you can see running down, and this in order to protect deny these heights from the Germans, because then they will be able to artillery observe down onto the bridges across the Orne. And so this is the Merville Ridge here, and basically this road and all this access here becomes the front line, and the Germans will be pushing up here. They know that this ridge is important because this was what will enable them to command the battlefield down to and over the river. Okay, so we're just approaching an hour, so I'll start wrapping it up. Just a heads up of what happens in afterwards. They end up at finding some stiff resistance at Amfreville. They get relieved on the 7th of June by number 3 Commando. The wounded, many of the wounded, they have to leave in a farm close to the battery, and they were being looked after by German medical orderlies. They then, these injured, which were left up here, they are rescued by the battalion padre John Gwinnett, who ferries them to the field ambulance, parachute field ambulance at Le Mesnil. Let me just find out where that is for you. Le Mesnil. Yeah, so Le Mesnil is down here. So he ferries these injured from the German medical orderlies down this way to it's near Ranville, and it's this is Ranville and Herouvelet, and Le Mesnil, I believe, is this junction here. So he ferries them down to this position here. And one of those is and 3 of those that he ferries down is Major Parry, Captain Hudson, and Lieutenant Jefferson. So, in review of the attack, Otway has come under criticism because it was deemed that the plan was just too complicated, and it relied too much on a lot of things going right. It involved, it had some assumptions that was the drop would be concentrated. It relied on the ability to gather a lot of equipment that was being dropped either by parachute or coming in with the paratroopers or coming in with gliders. As I've said, the plan to land 3 gliders in this battery has been criticized as what bordering on suicidal, but the fact that it was to be conducted in combination with an attack meant that there was too much that could go wrong. It was deemed possibly that the glider thing was just an added extra that wasn't needed. It would have been better for the gliders to just have landed on the drop zone and all the men come in with him. So you'd have a concentration of 50 men, and then your attack into the battery could be done by maybe not just 2 points of entry, but maybe 3. And of course, all of this is working on the premise that the Germans don't know. There's been a parachute drops going on. There's been bombardments of the position. You've got gliders now circling over it. You've kind of completely woken up this garrison. In his defense, you can only plan, with what you've got. You can only. He wasn't to know that the distribution on the battlefield would be so high that he wouldn't have enough men. He wasn't to know that majority of his heavy equipment wouldn't make it across, so that it was quite unlucky. So what he actually achieved on the day, after all these disappointments, is amazing. And many of his fellow officers and sergeants reported how calmly and quickly he adapted his plan and pushed on forward. And of course, he wasn't to know that the guns weren't what they were. That was a failure of reconnaissance, possible failure by the resistance, knowing what was the actual capabilities of this battery. Because if they had known that these guns were the lesser Czech variety, then they may not have wasted the resources at all on attacking this position. Now, but it's lesser known than the attacks on the bridges, because they went perfectly and this one didn't go perfectly. But you could argue that the attack on this position is the most amazing thing that anyone on this battlefield, this part of the battlefield, is asked to do. The fact that it is achieved, the battery is silenced for the majority of the of the morning is to the 9th Battalion, Parachute Battalion's credit, and to their commander. Let me just Rudolf Steiner, Lieutenant Rudolf Steiner, who was the commander of the battery, he was in the observation post at Franceville Plage. So he is he's the guy who instructed the guns, the flat guns or whatever, mortars, to fire on his own battery position. He came up with a theory that all the paratroopers had to do was to destroy the optics. Something as simple as that would have put the guns out of action for longer. He reoccupies the battery when the 9th Parachute Battalion withdraws, and he says that he found that 3 of the 4 guns were able to fire, and at least 2 on D-Day fired on Ouistreham and the Orne Estuary and the canal. So that sort of shows you that the range these guns had was basically to this this area here, and that it effectively, he admits that that the guns couldn't affect Swordbury Beach. So was it a success? Well, of course it was. In terms of the, knocking some of the guns at them, and you had to do it because you didn't know that the battery didn't have the guns you thought that they had. 70 odd casualties in this fight. You can argue until the cows come home whether it was worth it. But it had to be done. So, just to summarize, Lieutenant Colonel Otway, he receives a DSO, and Major Alan Parry is awarded the Military Cross, and the military medal is awarded to Company Sergeant Major George Miller, Sergeant Sid Knight, Sergeant Patrick McGeever, and Corporal James McGuinness. So let me finish there. Thank you for watching. We've pretty much finished now our talk here on Operation Tonga, and in the next episodes on D-Day we'll be discussing the US Airborne divisions on the west flank of the invasion beaches, So like and subscribe for more of the same. We won't necessarily next time be talking about Normandy. We have plans to talk about the Napoleonic Wars. But we will be coming back to finish off the talk on D-Day. And then we will be talking more about the actual campaign of Normandy itself. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.